My guest today is Professor Michael Frank, who's Professor of Cognitive and Psychological Sciences at Brown University. His research interests include cognitive neuroscience, higher level cognition, and computational models of mind, brain, and behavior. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I got a number of your interesting papers from 2025 and 2024. Looks like you have been very productive last couple of years. And so I want to start with beyond gradients, factorized geometric control of interference and generalization. So you say here interference and generalization, which refer to counterproductive and useful interactions between learning episodes, respectively, are poorly understood in biological neural networks, whereas much previous work has addressed these topics in terms of specialized brain systems. Here we investigated how learning rules should impact them. And you say here we found that plasticity between groups of neurons can be decomposed into biologically meaningful factors with factor geometry controlling interference and generalization. So I don't know. I don't have any background in neuroscience, Michael. I've been sort of involved in what is now called artificial intelligence for about 3 decades. Deep learning networks and those types of things. And I should let you know I have an ingoing bias into this conversation, and that is, and I want to get your perspective on this. That I believe neural networks, artificial neural networks, and biological neural networks are very different things. They approach the problems quite differently, and the parallels that we could draw between them appear very scant to me. So I want to get your perspective on this. But before we get there, so interference and generalization, could you sort of define those terms?
Yeah, sure. So interference is when you have a representation in the mind or in the brain for solving a particular task, for example. So let's say you learn to play tennis, and then when you want to apply it to another task that might overlap to some degree, I'm just thinking about this off the fly, but I suppose let's say it was ping pong or something.
Yeah.
So if you literally try to apply what you learned about swinging a tennis racket in a court to ping pong, uh, you would fail horribly because the rules of the physics are different, even though there's some shared superficial similarities and some actually deep similarities between the games. And so interference would be like if you really focus on learning one task
Hmm.
and then switch to the other task, now you're learning to play ping pong and you're unlearning, if you're using the same neurons that are interfering with each other, you're unlearning what you had learned before for tennis. So you might then learn how to play ping pong, but then when you go back to tennis, you might completely forget how to play tennis. And
So,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt. So, in the artificial neural network sense, this is sort of overtraining that you're not really generalizing.
Um, Yeah, it could be overtraining. I mean, it's classically this is a phenomenon that was discovered in the 80s called catastrophic interference, and it was a property of artificial neural networks
Hmm.
that is not a property of humans. So if you just train a neural network through the regular learning mechanisms that have been known for a few decades, as you're familiar with, um, they will learn to make associations. You give it some input, you can give it an output, but if there's any overlap in those associations, like A goes with B, and then later on, you have to learn that, okay, now A goes with C.
Yeah.
The network will learn to change its little connection strengths between the artificial neurons to be able to say that A goes with C. But because it's using the very same neurons that it was using in response to A from the A-B association, all those tweaks will cause it to forget everything it ever knew about B, which is not what you see in human memory.
So, um, I want to get sort of a general perspective from you. So, we often, overfit um, artificial neural networks. And as you say, we don't find that often in biological neural networks. And we can even do one-shot learning often. and can extend that. So, what is sort of the fundamental difference between sort of a biological network and an artificial network? The mathematics that we are pursuing now, is it anywhere close to what the brain is actually doing?
The mathematics of artificial neural networks, or what we're
Artificial,
pursuing?
yeah, artificial neural networks, yeah.
Oh, I see. Well, I think the field is continually evolving, and to some degree, some aspects of artificial neural network research is being inspired by findings that we know about the brain, and vice versa. And I think there is a healthy interchange between them. But when you're just purely trying to engineer an artificial intelligence system to do what you want it to do, it's not necessarily going to resemble the way in which the brain works. And so often, before we get to artificial general intelligence, for a system to be counted as AI, it really just has to learn to do any given set of any given task in a reasonable way and do
Yeah.
some amount of generalization, I suppose, but still within that particular task. And so the engineer can sort of control a bunch of parameters of the models, a bunch of different choices that they have to make for it to get to solve that particular task.
Yeah.
And they don't care whether it's plausible, whether the brain is going, it's the way that it happens in the brain or not. Uh, and it might work very well, but it won't generalize to, a whole host of other kinds of tasks. The brain is equipped with mechanisms that know that it has to confront a whole set of different conflicts in what your drives might be. Maybe sometimes you're running away from a predator or seeking food, or maybe you have different motivations and you have to solve different tasks, and you have to be able to learn to confront all of that with one neural network that itself consists of
Mm.
many different modules.
Yeah, so sort of variety of experiences. You say here, just I think sort of related, we introduce a theory in which plasticity is determined according to products of these factors. And the factors are plasticity between groups of neurons that can be decomposed into biologically meaningful factors with factor geometry controlling interference and generalization. So, so when we look into a human brain, and I don't know much about this, Michael, I'm making this up, the plasticity is such a crazy thing, right? I mean, yeah, we can go from physics to chemistry to biology to economics, and that hasn't been seen in artificial systems.
Uh, you mean the ability for the artificial
The
systems
ability
to
to
be
go
able to
from,
recognize?
something completely different. So I mean, you mentioned AGI. So AGI is a good sort of a thing to think about here. So uh, what people are trying to do is to say, I have a general purpose machine that I'm just going to ask a new thing of the general purpose machine, and it's going to do it. But are we anywhere close to that in artificial systems?
I mean, I'm probably not the perfect person in the world to ask that question. And everybody has a different opinion about that. I
Yeah.
don't think we're close right now, but I guess I would say that the inflection point that we're in with artificial intelligence keeps changing rapidly, and it's very hard to predict, to extrapolate for a few years. So
Mhm.
I don't think we're very close to achieving what goes on inside a biological brain, because most of the artificial systems don't have bodies and they don't have goals and they're not interacting in social environments.
Mhm.
And all those things I think are really important for the kinds of intelligence that humans have. But I do think it's possible that the systems will get more generally intelligent in ways that are hard to predict and might not resemble human intelligence.
So what do you mean by plasticity here?
Okay, yeah. So I think this might help in terms of connecting
Yeah.
to, and artificial neural networks that have been around for a few decades. Essentially, the way it works is there's a pattern of inputs that they see, might be some representing something visual or in any modality, and then they have to learn to transform those inputs to something else, like making a prediction or maybe selecting an action if they're going to play a video game or whatever they're being trained to do, or classify whether the image is a cat or a dog or whatever.
Yeah.
And initially, a neural network, just has random connections, and what it spews out at its output is just random. It's wrong. It has to be.
Mhm.
But then the standard approach for training a neural network is just to tell the network, here's what would have been correct, and here's the error.
Yeah.
And mathematicians or computer scientists developed over the last few decades are algorithms to figure out how should I change each connection in the entire network so that the next time I see the same input, I'm going to be correct.
Mhm.
Now, there's some standard kind of calculus that's done for that. But one of the major problems there is that works if you know as an engineer you want to change the weights to make the to do better next time, but it does require knowing not only what the output should have been at the output layer of the network, what it should have said, but it
Mhm.
requires knowing what all the other weights in the entire network are. So the change in the connections between two neurons doesn't have to know only anything about those neurons that are connected to each other. They also have to know how other neurons in other parts of the network are connected to each other in
Mhm.
order for the algorithm to work, which is fine if you're doing it just through computer science or through math. But in the brain, uh, we need a physical way in which plasticity can happen. And by plasticity, I just mean how one neuron is more likely to change the activity of another neuron. That can go up. If one neuron fires, it's more likely to make the next neuron fire, or it could go down. If that neuron fires, it's less likely to make the next neuron fire. And biologically, there is very well studied what the mechanisms are that allow for that plasticity to occur. It has to do with, for example, receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, the neuron that is listening to the sending neuron, and the amount of neurotransmitter that is sent by the presynaptic neuron, and various other factors. But the key point is that the information has to be local to that synapse. It has to be physically available to that synapse. And the algorithms that are used in artificial neural networks do not have that locality constraint. They have to know about things that they don't actually have access to.
Mhm.
So a lot of work has been done to try to figure out how in the brain, there are a lot of different approximate algorithms that could say, using biologically realistic assumptions, can we get it to approximate something like what engineers devise for artificial neural networks?
Mhm.
But I think it also is useful to think about the brain might leverage a lot of other mechanisms that are not exactly the mechanisms that engineers happen to think about to solve these problems in artificial neural nets.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting. As you called it, locality constraint. And I remember, Michael, reading something like 3, 4 years ago that said there is sort of a Wi-Fi network in the brain that allows neurons to communicate long distance. Yeah, and so they can be influenced not just by local connections, but rather from information from long distance in the brain context. So do you think neurons are sort of? Do you think? First of all, do you think that's happening in the brain?
I'm not sure which finding you're referring to. There are many different ways in which neurons can communicate. There are gap junctions which are like electrical contacts between neurons that are separate from the synapses. You might be referring to the idea that each, groups of neurons emit electrical field potentials and oscillations that could influence activity in other neurons not too far away, but that are not physically in contact with them, which is a controversial idea, and that's possible. But I don't think anybody has devised a learning rule that would depend on that kind of communication. That the key point is that you still need to have access if you're trying to get networks to learn something that's useful for reducing the errors that it's going to make the next time it's trying to do a similar task. It has to know something about the errors that it made. It has to know something about the local information that it could use physically. So if that information is available through some other signal besides what's just in the synapse through detecting of population activity through oscillations or whatever, that might be possible, but that's certainly not what anybody has explored in neural network theory at this point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the locality constraint, as you mentioned, most of the things that we design are local. That is what the mathematics allows us to do. But generally speaking, there's so much information that is non-local. It makes somewhat suboptimum to make a decision by just talking to my neighbors, you know. So if I have six neighbors here and I say, well, is the world going to going to hell? I'm just going to talk to those six people. I probably come up with a wrong decision because the information is too localized. Um,
Yeah, so there are, I mean, one of the things that we're considering in the paper you're referring to and building off other work, there are still some global mechanisms of how are things going in general. So if I'm trying to play tennis and I hit the racket and it happens to score a point, I might not have the local information about exactly which neurons were responsible for exactly the movement I made, but I do get a reward signal that tells me that was pretty good.
mhm,
And there are neurochemicals that are very well studied to convey aspects of how much better was the outcome than you expected. So famously, the dopamine system conveys that signal, and that's something that I've been studying for a long time.
yeah.
And there's a lot of great work on that. And that dopamine signal will get broadcast relatively globally. I mean, I hesitate to say that because it's actually more nuanced than that. And the dopamine system is, we continue to be learning from its nuances and how awesome it is. But for the sake of this conversation, you can think of it as there's a lot of local connections. But if there's a broadcast signal that says, oh, things just went better than expected,
Mm,
then you can have a learning rule that's still local in that the neurons are sensitive to how active a presynaptic neuron is and a postsynaptic neuron, how they're connected. And then you have this third factor that says, did things just get better or worse? And that third factor gets broadcast to a lot of neurons, but the amount of plasticity that you have
mm,
depends on all three factors together. So it's not that the connections are just going up everywhere in the brain. It's going to be proportional to how, at the moment in time in which that reward signal happened,
mm.
how active was the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron relative to how average they're active. So if they're relatively more active than usual and there was a reward signal, then you can increase the plasticity. And that's one way of getting a local learning rule to still be sensitive to global goals of the agent, that if those neurons were participating in the success of the agent as a whole, then on average, over the course of multiple samples of experience, that does produce the right result. A network using that kind of learning rule will get to optimal performance eventually.
So there's a learning effect, there's a teaching effect in some ways. So if two neurons did something and the outcome was really good, the rest of the system probably want to learn from that because they can use it in the future. So it's some sort of a global um, good. I would imagine really good and really bad experiences stored that lot of other participants could get access to longitudinally over time, right? Is that true?
Other participants mean other neurons?
Other neurons, yeah.
Yeah, certainly, especially if other neurons are well connected to the two neurons that were active at the time where the reward signal happened, then they might be more likely to recruit those other neurons, and then they'll get sort
Mm.
of share the benefits because they're already connected to them, and so they'll get further reinforced, they'll get further connected, and then as a population, they should increase the probability that that same pattern reproduces in the future.
So the network changes in some way. So if there's a really good outcome, let's say between two neurons, and all the adjacent ones, basically saying, "Oh, this is great," let's connect to these guys. So a really good outcome and a really bad outcome forces some sort of network change. Is that the way to think about it? I'm just making this up, Michael. I have no clue.
Absolutely have bad outcomes. I mean, one of the things that we study in one part of the brain where reinforcement learning is very well studied is that there are actually two opponent pathways that learn from really good outcomes and bad outcomes in opponent ways. So it's not just that when things get worse, you decrease the connections between neurons. In fact, there's a whole set of neurons that seem to be specialized in learning to increase the connections when things are bad,
Mm.
but those neurons are in turn responsible for avoiding those actions in the future. So they're actively learning that that's a bad action to choose, and so you should suppress it in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's a risk management system, right? So, I mean, most of our 300,000 years Homo sapiens basically was trying to survive. Animals around, there were other clans around. So risk management is actually more important than even finding food or water or anything like that, because if I don't have time to find food and water and I get killed in the process, it doesn't really help me. So risk management, I think I would imagine the bad outcomes are actually much. Let me make a statement. Let you object to it. Bad outcomes are should be more weighted or more important for the brain than good outcomes, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. If you're likely to get killed, then you probably should not go searching for a little bit of food that might satiate your hunger for a few hours.
Yeah, so you talked about dopamine. So I want to get into another paper that talks about that specifically. Adaptive cost benefit control fueled by striatal dopamine. You say here the 21st century has brought forth a deluge of theories and data shedding light on the neural mechanisms of motivated behavior. Much of this progress has focused on dopaminergic dynamics, including their signaling properties and their downstream impacts in target regions. In parallel, the basic basal ganglia have been elevated from their original implication in motoric function to a canonical circuit, facilitating the initiation, invigoration, and selection of actions across levels of abstraction from motor to cognitive operations. So I guess our original idea of basal ganglia was more mechanical, and now we are finding that it's not just mechanical, it's something much more cognitive.
Yeah, I mean, this is touching on essentially my first love in science, which is trying to extend what, you know, a great amount of research was done on how the basal ganglia is involved in motor control and how that relates to dopamine signaling there. And there are various patient populations who have damage to the basal ganglia in different ways that very clearly have problems with motor control. So Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, Tourette syndrome, some aspects of hyperactivity and ADHD all involve changes in the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is also very well conserved across species, across mammals, and even below, before mammals. So it's easy to it's a nice system for studying that then also transfers to humans. But one of the things that we have been focusing on in my lab and also others is that rather than thinking of the basal ganglia as a system that just controls motor function action in a mechanical way, like you're saying, it's a more general system that evolution has co-opted to control whatever's happening in the front part of the brain. So the whole front part of the brain is devoted to action, but the
Yeah.
most posterior part of the front part of the brain is the motor cortex. That's just literally controlling the muscles that go down your spinal cord. But as you go more forward in the frontal cortex, you have actions that are increasingly abstract, like motor planning. I want to plan to reach, I want to plan to go order a coffee, or I'm even going to make an action, which is a decision to hold something in my mind about what I'm going to do next, or
Mm.
make a decision about what restaurant I'm going to go to, or do mental arithmetic. They're taking actions there where you're deciding here's the part of the problem you want to work on now, and you're going to hold on to some piece of information while you figure out some other parts of the problem. So it turns out that the basal ganglia are densely interconnected with all parts of the frontal cortex, and that it looks like they are controlling not just a selection of simple motor programs, but
Mm.
in a very sort of analogous way, they are involved in circuits that link to selecting cognitive actions, including those memory operations I was talking about.
Yeah, so this has some connection to this local and global things, right? So am I understanding this correctly, Michael, that the motor actions, the mechanical signals, um, are more local, um, and sort of the cognitive things could be more global. Is that the right way to think about it?
Um, yes, but actually in a slightly different way than the way we were talking about local and global before. I think before we were talking about local and global in spatial terms. So like you have
Yeah.
neurons that are connected locally, and then there's like the global function of the network as a whole. I think now we're talking about maybe spatial temporally or temporally because so in the motor system, you might, make a individual motor action and find out whether it achieved what you wanted to achieve
Mm.
immediately, essentially, because you see the outcome of your motor choices. But in the cognitive space, let's say you're doing mental arithmetic, you have to try some strategies of like when you're trying to solve some reasoning problem or some math problem, you don't really know what are the right operations to use, what might work, what might not work.
Mm.
And you're not going to find out immediately either because you have to do sort of by nature of the cognitive task a sequence of such operations, and only at the end you find out was that actually useful for solving the problem or not. So there's sort of this longer time scale, and that leads to what we often study in this field called of the field of credit assignment, which
Yeah.
is how do you know um, if you got an outcome that was good, but it was much later from when you first initiated a critical action that then led to that outcome, how do
Mm.
you assign credit to the action that was responsible for that outcome?
If it's
So I would
much
say,
later, if the outcome is much later.
right. Yeah. So I think that these same basal ganglia and cortical systems are involved at all of those scales, but it does become increasingly challenging as you get longer spatial temporal patterns that
Mm.
have to exist between the critical action and the outcome. But there are ways in which, for example, neurons in the prefrontal cortex, they sustain their activity over time. So instead of a neuron just getting active in response to an input, there are neurons in the prefrontal cortex that are famously involved in holding information over delays. So like if I tell you to hold a thought in your mind, literally holding that thought on your mind is going to be sustained activation of not just one neuron, but a pattern of neurons with sort of interesting dynamics
Mm.
that can help your brain sort of span the gap between when I told you to hold that thought in your mind and then you're later asked a question related to that thought. That helps it sort of bridge the gap between the relevant initial representation and the outcome later on. But all of that has to be learned by the system,
Mm.
through reinforcement learning or through other kinds of learning mechanisms, which are part of the focus of our research.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Michael. I haven't thought much about this. So we clearly don't do this in artificial neural networks. It is more local, and on the time axis, as you say, it's definitely local. Basically the loss function minimization process, data going back. Um, it so do we have evidence? So let me ask you. My brain is spinning, Michael. I haven't really thought about this. So if the brain is saying, well, I got a not a very good outcome here, but I want to hold this data, hold this outcome for a bit. And then when there is another signal in the future, I might weigh that outcome in a more optimized fashion. Is the brain doing that in some ways?
Um, yeah, I think it may be doing that. It has to undergo what we think of as a exploration process in the sense that it
Yeah.
doesn't know what the right thoughts are to hold in mind until later on. So sometimes there's this trade-off between exploration and exploitation. And that's
Mm.
something that I think the brain is constantly having to solve. And even basic aspects of reinforcement learning, including animals that are foraging for food. But you could apply that same kind of formalism for thinking about the explore versus exploit problem to thoughts that you have to hold in mind because they might be useful for later figuring out a problem.
But it's costly, right? So I got some feedback, and that feedback looks not that useful in the current context. But if I decide to hold it, on the expectation that that feedback in the context of future, when more data or more experiments are done, might be useful, might be quite valuable. If I'm holding it, that's expensive, right? I mean, there is a limited space to hold anything.
That's exactly right. I think that's also one of the frontiers of the field that in human cognition, there's what we're talking about here is working memory, the ability to hold information in mind and the ability to hold multiple bits of information in mind at the same time and to manipulate those information. And working memory capacity in people is famously limited. I mean, it's much greater than it is in other animals, but it's limited to roughly 3 to 4 items that you could hold in mind at any one time. If
Yeah.
you think of them as discrete items, that's somewhat debated itself, but certainly the amount of bits of information you could hold in mind at any one time is limited. And there's a question as to why is it so limited? And it's not really that we don't have enough neurons to hold multiple pieces of information in mind. But actually, I think, and this is one of the results of another theoretical paper that we put out recently,
Yeah.
is that the reason why there are limits in the number of in the capacity of working memory is really computational. It's really for the reason that you just
Mm.
mentioned, that it's costly, and that if you try to hold on to too many bits of information at the same time, it will become very difficult to know which of those bits of information was actually relevant for the
Mm.
outcome that you observed afterwards, and the brain would get confused.
It becomes noisy. Yeah.
Yeah,
So this paper that I think you're talking about, this paper. So adaptive chunking improves effective working memory capacity in a frontal cortex and basal ganglia circuit. So you say here, how and why is working memory capacity limited? Traditional cognitive accounts focus either on limitations on the number of items that can be stored, as you mentioned, maybe four. So slots models. So you've got four slots, and once those four slots are occupied, you're out of luck. Or loss of precision with increasing load, resource models. And so you can store a lot of stuff, but over time you can't really recollect or use them in a very precise fashion. So you say here we show that a neural network model of prefrontal cortex and basal ganglia can learn to reuse the same prefrontal populations to store multiple items, leading to resource-like constraints within a slot-like system and inducing trade-off between quantity and precision of information. Yeah, I didn't quite understand this, Michael. So could you explain that sort of the sort of resource-like constraints within a slot-like system?
sure. I'll try to explain that as well as the general idea that you just articulated from our abstract. So yeah, like you said, there's like two camps that seem like they're totally different. That either you have a discrete number of slots, so you can just remember 4 items and then you're out of luck, or if you're given 8 items to remember, maybe you can remember all 8 of them, but each one of them with less precision because they're all going into a common pool of neurons and sort of competing with each other, and eventually you start filling up the sort of space of neurons is essentially the idea, so that you're less precise in remembering any of the individual items.
Yeah.
And there's evidence for both of those camps have gone back and forth over like 10 or 20 years of science. So it's like many aspects of science, there's a little bit of both. That seems to be correct. And so what we're saying is that you could have a slots-like system in that you could have isolated populations of neurons that can store information that are disconnected from other isolated populations of neurons. So the
Mm.
prefrontal cortex can maintain stuff in one population of neurons, and it can maintain something completely different in another population of neurons.
Mm.
But if you have an active decision-making system about what goes into each of those populations of neurons, which is what we think the basal ganglia is in the context of cognitive function, like we alluded to earlier in this discussion,
Mm.
then you could essentially choose to put multiple items in the same population, and then within that population, those items will suffer from resource constraints because the representations will sort of merge and interfere with each other a little bit. And so you'll lose some kind of precision for those items. But um, so let's say you had 5 items to remember and you have 4 slots, just to keep
Mm,
it simple.
mm,
You could either decide I'm going to remember 4 and forget 1, or you could say I'm going to put 3 of them in individual slots, and the last 2 I'll put in another slot, and I'll be less precise about each one of those last 2, but
mm,
that saves my space for remembering all the other ones precisely.
mm,
And the strategic thing to do there is if the 2 items are similar enough to each other, you can use a strategy that says items that are similar enough to each other can be so-called chunked or merged. And therefore, you do lose precision about each one of them, but because both of them are similar enough to each other, losing precision about both each of them still gives you a fairly good high fidelity representation of each of them. So
mm.
you take a little bit of a hit or a loss in precision, but at the advantage of getting to store essentially everything in that example. You have everything else is precise, and those 2 are stored with minimal errors. And so if you can then uh, learn a strategy of when it's useful to do that chunking and when you don't need to do that chunking, you can try to enhance the effective capacity of the system.
Yeah, as you're talking, Michael, I was just thinking, do we have any data on some people are better at this chunking process? What I mean is that, if you look at scientists, who work on abstract things, I'm just making this up, Michael, as opposed to, engineers who work at precise things. Do we have any data that, this artists, musicians, maybe, and scientists more working on, astrophysics or something like that, are they better at chunking compared to others?
It's a fantastic question. I don't think there's good data on that. It's much easier to study quantitatively this kind of chunking process with honestly more boring tasks that involve just like remembering colored shapes on a screen and then testing people, and they can measure the histogram of their errors and quantify when they're chunking and when they're not. But I think there's a good question there, which is in those kind of tasks, the things that you might be chunking are just like something that is orangish with something that is reddish. So it's like in the color space, you're looking at how close they are to each other, and maybe you might as well chunk those 2 colors that are similar to each other. It's easy enough to think about what similarity means in that space. But there are other domains where, let's say you're a scientist and you're drawing on analogies from something you know about physics and something you know about chemistry, and you notice some similarity between those 2 things. If you're very well trained to detect the analogies, then your neural representations are still going to overlap at a higher level of abstraction. And then you may be able to chunk things together because they make sense to you. Those are already encoded as similar to each other. And so I suspect people with scientific training may perform better at tasks that require that overload working memory capacity when the thing that they're trying to store in mind has to do with their expertise. They might be able to chunk them better, whereas a musician may do better at chunking information related to their expertise than a scientist. So it really has to do with your predisposition to represent things as similar, and the yeah, like the musical scales may be really easy for a particular musician to chunk from one instrument to another that might not be easy for a scientist.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So I want to go into another. We talked a little bit about so basal ganglia components have distinct computational roles in decision-making dynamics under conflict and uncertainty. So you say here the basal ganglia play a key role in decision-making, preventing impulsive actions in some contexts while facilitating fast adaptations in others. The specific contributions of different basal ganglia structures to this nuanced behavior remain unclear, particularly under varying situations of noisy and conflicting information that necessitate ongoing adjustments in the balance between speed and accuracy. Yeah, this is really interesting for me, Michael. I've done some work in sort of decision making under uncertainty,
Hmm.
in sort of the business context, mostly. And I always wondered uncertainty. So it seems like some percent of the population just doesn't like uncertainty. You know, they rather have everything deterministic. It's binary outcomes. As soon as you say there is a probability distribution out there, they get very uncomfortable about that. Uh, is that can we sort of assign that to the basal ganglia structure, experience, whatever you want to call it? Are people different in that context?
Yeah, people are certainly different, and I would say there's different aspects to uncertainty avoidance or uncertainty aversion as you're mentioning it. Some of it has to do with the cortical representations of uncertainty, the sort of the yeah, the court, and some of it has to do with the decision process given a certain amount of uncertainty. So in that paper, what we're focusing on in terms of the basal ganglia is um, when given uncertain evidence, so let's say you're the kinds of tasks that are often used in that field are you're making perceptual decisions and you see a bunch of random dots going one side or the other, and you have to decide on average are the dots moving to the left or to the right, for example. But let's say it's only 5% of the dots are moving to the right and everything else is moving randomly. It's not very easy to know when you just look at the screen for a couple of or for a few hundred milliseconds. It's not obvious because it just looks like a bunch of noise. But if you accumulate the evidence over multiple samples, you can start to realize that there's a signal in there.
Mm.
So uh, the models that are often used in sort of the mathematical space here, even separate from the brain, are models that are, uh, generally known as sequential sampling models. Essentially, you sample a bit of evidence that takes you towards one decision boundary or the other decision boundary.
Yeah.
And even though there's some noise in that process, eventually it'll go high enough that there'll be evidence that you're in one state or another. And in models like that, there's something called the decision boundary, which is how much evidence do you need before you're confident enough to say, okay, I'm done. I know this is not just noise. Things are going mostly to the left or mostly to the right. And that boundary, or sometimes called the decision threshold, you can think of as a way, a sort of tolerance for uncertainty.
Yeah.
Because if it's very low, then you're willing to take, just a little bit of noise and say, I think it's going that way. But if you really want to be confident, you would just sample, sample, and sample more and more evidence until you would respond.
Mm.
So there's a part of the basal ganglia called the subthalamic nucleus, which uh, which we and others have shown helps to control that decision threshold. So when it's more active,
Mm.
you require more evidence before you're willing to finally commit to a motor response.
Mm.
And it's sensitive to uncertainties, essentially, conflict and uncertainty.
Yeah. So I didn't read the paper in detail, Michael. So you talk about Parkinson's disease here. Um, so are there pharmaceutical approaches? So I'm reading might be too much into this, but so if you say the Parkinson's disease has some connection to, um, how the basal ganglia and other aspects of the brain is working in the sort of making decisions, maybe there's a delay in the decisions when there is uncertainty. Can we, do we have any data if we can actually influence that through pharmaceuticals?
Yes, well, the most relevant data for this particular thing is actually through deep brain stimulation, which is a different procedure that complements pharmaceuticals. So the pharmaceuticals that are given to Parkinson's disease are largely dopaminergic medications, and that
Yep.
does influence decision making, but in a way that's sort of orthogonal to this uncertainty aspect. It causes people to focus more on the benefits than on the costs of their decisions. But the subthalamic nucleus, which is the target of deep brain stimulation surgery, that's where they put an electrode in there. Uh, Before they do the surgery, that region is hyperactive in Parkinson's disease, which
Mm.
means that the effective decision threshold is higher. It's harder to initiate an action, and that could be a motor action or a cognitive action in patients with Parkinson's disease. Uh, Also, we think actually patients with OCD have a similar
Mm.
problem not due to the same underlying mechanism of dopamine, but due to other mechanisms that I won't go into in detail. But I mention that for a reason because being averse to uncertainty is a key aspect of OCD as well. And so if you apply deep brain stimulation instead of pharmaceuticals, uh, that it's very high frequency stimulation, and it effectively acts like what's sometimes referred to as an information lesion. So even though you're stimulating the area, you're essentially decoupling its ability to respond to its inputs from the cortex, which convey this information about uncertainty. And we know that from various aspects of animal research. If you lesion that area, you get a similar behavioral result than when you give that high frequency stimulation. Anyway, so the point is that in Parkinson's disease, by applying deep brain stimulation to that region, you do facilitate more natural movement. Movement performance gets better. But in some subset of patients, they can exhibit symptoms of impulsivity as a result of stimulating in that region. And we think that impulsivity is due to reducing that decision threshold too much, especially when you're experiencing situations of conflict or uncertainty.
Yeah.
And just if I can follow that up very quickly, is that
Yeah.
it turns out that some patients with OCD are actually therapeutically treated when DBS is deep brain stimulation is applied to that region, their symptoms get better. And so if they're normally super averse to uncertainty, so they're perfectionists and they're continually checking before they make a decision, if that system is hyperactive, but now you somewhat normalize it by applying the deep brain stimulation, they can come to a decision more swiftly and it becomes normalized. So in OCD, you can actually help them. In Parkinson's disease, because that wasn't their problem in the first place, it can actually cause them to be impulsive.
Oh, wow. Okay. Is the effect tactical? What I mean is that, so first of all, to do the deep brain stimulation, do you have to wear some sort of device?
No, well, there's a battery that's implanted usually in
Oh,
here, but it's the electrode is you go undergo surgery, but the electrode is implanted, and after you escape from surgery, you don't need a device anymore. It's just implanted inside you.
and so what I mean by the is the effect tactical when you flip the switch on, you get an
Oh,
effect. When you
yes.
flip the switch off, you don't get the effect.
Yeah, and that's what the neurologists do, but we also do it experimentally. We can bring patients into the lab and turn them on and turn them off. There's like essentially a remote control. And you can see their symptoms come and go almost immediately when you turn them on or off. There's tremor, Parkinson's tremor comes back when you turn them off. But also you can see experimentally in the lab when they're running these decision-making experiments that their decision threshold goes down when you turn them on and it goes back up when you turn them off.
I know that you have a timing constraint, but I just want to touch one more last paper. Keeping
Okay.
an eye out for change, anxiety disrupts adaptive resolution of policy uncertainty. It's sort of related to OCD and Parkinson's we talked about. So you see, human learning unfolds under uncertainty. Uncertainty is heterogeneous with different forms exerting distinct influences on learning. While one can be uncertain about what to do to maximize rewarding outcomes, known as policy uncertainty, one can also be uncertain about general world knowledge, known as epistemic uncertainty. So you say here in complex and naturalistic environments such as a social world, adaptive learning may hinge on striking a balance between attending to and resolving each type of uncertainty. Yeah, this is really interesting. So when we sort of go in one direction or the other, it sort of shows up in some diseases, mental or CNS, more generally CNS related diseases. And so this also goes back to, are there interventions we could do, right, to alleviate these issues?
So you're asking about whether there are interventions that could be done to change people's sensitivity to different kinds of uncertainty?
Yeah, so
Or,
so anxiety disrupts adaptive resolution of policy uncertainty. So
yes.
um, so just describe that a little bit. Yeah. So what is the data that we're using?
Yeah, so here this was a study run by Amrita Lamba, who was a graduate student at the time, and she was studying social decision making actually between two agents. So you're deciding to invest trust in another agent, you give them some money, and they might give you some money back. And if they give you enough money back, it's worth investing in them because the amount of money you give to them gets multiplied by four, and if they give you enough money back, then everybody does better. But the other agent could also decide to kind of screw them over and not give them enough money back. So you should then not invest in them. But the person has to learn whether the person they're investing in is trustworthy or not.
Mm.
And in her experiment, she had people play games with multiple such other agents, and some of them were trustworthy and some of them weren't. And moreover, they were changing over time. So the person had to actually learn who's worth trusting and then uh, at what point to switch. And so policy uncertainty in that case is your uncertainty about whether your decision to trust is the right one. So in that case, as long as the person is giving you enough money back, according to just maximizing your returns, how much money you're going to get, there's just a certain threshold of how much money they have to give you back, at which point you should just always invest the full amount in them every time.
Mm.
And so your uncertainty about whether you're doing the right thing just depends on whether they're above that threshold or not, or if they're close to that threshold. But so that's policy uncertainties, uncertainty about your decision. Should I invest or not? Epistemic uncertainty would be if I really want to know what kind of person is that person, are they going to give me back 50% of the money or just 30% of the money or 25% of the money?
Mm.
That might mean different things. And if I really want to know what that number is, exactly what the percentage is, and also how quickly they're changing or other things, then I might be wanting to learn something about that person that might be unrelated to how well I do at this particular task. So
Mm.
policy uncertainty is really the uncertainty for maximizing your decision process for maximizing returns. Epistemic uncertainty is like the uncertainty about just the knowledge of the person in general, which could be useful for some other interaction you might have with them later on, but isn't useful immediately for that task.
So you say here those with increased anxiety, these are small studies, total N of 94, do not flexibly switch between resolving policy and epistemic uncertainty, and instead express less uncertainty overall. And so anxiety being sort of a global phenomenon, I'm making this up,
Mm.
it seems to have localized effect on these on this decision processes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're still trying to understand that. And you're right, it's also a small study, and I think anxiety is itself very, very heterogeneous. But um, I think there's something that was learned from that study, which is that they're differentially sensitive to focusing on policy uncertainty and not epistemic uncertainty.
Mm.
And you can see that in their actions. So uh, when somebody starts to become untrustworthy, they're sort of actually overly likely to continue to give them money, and they're not
Mm.
adjusting fast enough. But she could see that not just in their behavior, but in computational models that dissect the different kinds of uncertainty, but also looking at their eye gaze. The way that she designed the experiment is that you can quantify how uncertain they are by asking them to predict how much money is that other person going to give back to you. And they
Mm.
had to do that by moving their eyes along the screen. And we could tell that by just looking at the standard deviation of how much they're moving their eyes back and forth,
Mm.
that was actually quantifying how uncertain they are about how much the person was going to give back. Like the mean of where they looked was faithfully representing what their
Mm.
prediction was going to be about how much they were going to give back. But the variance is really about the uncertainty.
Is there a cognitive load issue here, Michael? I'm thinking when I'm anxious, I sort of don't want to play any games, maybe. The brain is sort of saying, I'm sort of busy with my internal issues. Is that a cognitive load issue for the brain in the experiment?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, sometimes that becomes a challenge in interpreting behavior in patient populations. If they're performing less well, it could be that they're not paying as much attention to the rules of the task that we care about. and because they're paying attention to something internal or cognitive load. I don't think that's the case in this particular experiment because they were behaving quite lawfully in most of the settings. It was just in this very specific case when uncertainty changed that they weren't sensitive to it in the same way.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, I know that you have to go. Yeah, this has been great. Yeah, thanks so much
Yeah,
for
it's
spending
been
time
super
with me.
fun for me as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.